And I will immediately invite our next speaker, Sophie Henderson, UK keynote, the CEO of the British Migration Museum, talking about delivering Britain's missing migration museum.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. I would like to tell you a little bit about what we refer to as, there we are, as Britain's Missing Museum, our project to create a permanent migration museum for Britain. And this is a project which has been in existence for about 12 years now. We've put on 10 exhibitions. We've had various temporary homes. At the moment, we're in a home in the middle of a really busy South London shopping centre where we've been for the last 4 years, which has been a really fantastic thing. But our incredibly exciting news is that we now have the prospect of a permanent home, the opportunity for a permanent home as part of a new development which is now being built right in the heart of the City of London that's going to be ready in 3 years' time. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our journey, why we think we need a migration museum in Britain, how we think we can make a difference, and there's some of the things that we have learned along the way that we're going to bring to bear in delivering this permanent museum. I hope delivering this permanent museum in a few years' time. So why? Well, we say, you know, Britain is really a country that's been kind of made from migration. It's an essential British story. It's the story of who we are. It's where we've come from. It's where we're going to. And it's a story that's kind of around us all, you know, in plain sight, if only we choose to put the right glasses on. It's the story of the shops we frequent, from the high street giants like Marks and Spencer to the market stalls and corner shops. It's the story of the food we eat, the language we speak, the institutions like the British royal family, you know, that's a great migration story. The institutions that are, you know, dearest and closest to our hearts, like the National Health Service. These are huge migration stories, and actually there is a British design icon designed by a migrant, a Greek migrant to Britain, Sir Alec Isigonis. So migration is an essential British story, and we think nothing less will do than a permanent institution that puts that story right at centre stage where it belongs. Migration is a long story, longer than people often appreciate. It's obviously a really complicated story, and it's not just about immigration, but also about emigration. And this actually is a often overlooked aspect of British migration, that right up until 1983, and I think this often surprises people, Britain was a massive exporter of people, actually a country of net emigration, not immigration. A complicated story. This is, I guess, an aspect of the sort of complexity which has there are hundreds of these, but this has a particular sort of contemporary resonance. This was one of Britain's first Indian-born MPs, Bownagri, and he was elected to Parliament in about 1912. At a time when there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. There were a lot of poor, largely Jewish refugees coming from Eastern Europe and Russia, and the popular press was very sort of anti-immigrant. And we just enacted the Aliens Act, which was the first bit of legislation which was designed to keep people out of the country. Before that, people could come and go as they please. And this was his election platform, which was an anti-immigrant platform, really. What's one of the principal causes of increased house rent in East London? Foreign pauper aliens. And I suppose that an obvious kind of contemporary echo is we've just had our first Prime Minister, which is a brilliant thing, of South Asian heritage, Rishi Sunak. He was voted out of power just in the summer. But, you know, one of his signature pledges, in fact, his leading signature pledge, was largely anti-immigrant. It was about stopping the boats. Migration is a story to which we are all, without exception, personally connected. And I know that sounds on one level perhaps a little trivial or trite, but actually it's true, and I think it's profound, that if we dig back into our family histories, whoever you are, you have a personal connection to this story, whether through immigration or emigration. And these are migration museums, so those are, you know, why we think a migration museum matters. These are migration museums around the world. There's a very conspicuous gap in Britain, and it's high time that we put this on the map. And we think we can make a difference in 3 ways, principally. I think we can do something to contribute to a better conversation about migration. Migration is obviously a highly contested and polarizing and sort of dehumanized topic in the public domain, and often hijacked by the people who've got the noisiest voices, but not always the most interesting things to say. And I think if we show that there are ways in which we can find points of connection and not division on the topic of migration, if we show that we can contextualize contemporary conversations against a historical backdrop, backdrop, we can do something to contribute to a richer, slower, more stimulating, warmer, more enjoyable conversation about migration. We can certainly support teaching and learning about migration, and this is a huge and growing area of demand for the work that we do. The younger you go, the more ethnically diverse classrooms are, the greater the imperative for people to learn about history in a way that feels relevant to them. Teachers often find teaching about migration, it can be difficult, it's a sensitive topic, and actually it's a really powerful offer to be able to say to teachers, bring your students to the museum. This is something we can support you with. So this is a huge growth area for us. And it's about representation and people feeling seen and heard and valued, and that their stories matter. And I like this picture. We did an exhibition about the NHS, and we told the story of Filipino nurses. And actually, they're a significant proportion of NHS nurses, but it's a story that's actually not very well known. So sometimes it's about bringing the stories, from the periphery and kind of putting them at centre stage so that people feel that those stories, matter and that they're represented. And I like this particular picture. It's of a Filipino nurse called May Appleton arriving at Heathrow Airport in the 1960s. And I think there's something just about her glamour and the sort of excitement, I think, at her new life, which kind of comes across in this picture, but the human kind of story behind the broader story of the Filipino nurses in the NHS. So this is our current home. We are in a shopping centre. 14 million people go through the shopping centre each year. It's really busy. These two bits of the Berlin Wall are our kind of front door. They're on loan to us. And you can see our entrance. It's just between those two bits of the wall. And it was a former H&M store. So it's got a really nice kind of wide door into the museum, which is a sort of porous entrance. And it's, incongruously right next to a Starbucks and, all the other kind of shopping centre, high street stores. And our permanent home, I can't show you, unfortunately, a picture of what that's going to be like because it hasn't been built yet. It's literally just beginning to be built now. But this is a kind of a representation of it. So it's going to be right in the heart of the City of London. It's going to have a courtyard outside, which is exciting. So we hope we can replicate this idea of a porous entrance. It'll be over 3 floors, 2,800 square metres, which is not, it's not the size of this museum, but it's a reasonable size. And we've got an incredible deal, which is a 60-year rent and service charge-free term. And the story of the developer is really interesting because the person who's putting the building up, who owns the property company, was himself a refugee to Britain 40 years ago from Uganda. So for all of those reasons, it's an exciting project and it feels that it's realisable and it's achievable. And it will be at the heart of a wider ecosystem. So we will have the London Permanent Museum in London, but it's not just going to be a London story. We've been so taken by being in a shopping centre and the power, actually, of, we're doing something, I think, groundbreaking there. I know it's groundbreaking, actually, certainly in Britain, of putting a museum where people are rather than bringing people to the museum. We engage audiences that are radically different compared with the average for London museums. They're much more ethnically diverse, much more socioeconomically diverse. So part of our ecosystem is going to be the London Museum, but also a pop-up in a shopping centre each year so that we can take the story outside London and reach new audiences in new ways. So that's the vision for the future. And, can we do it? Obviously, I think we can do it. There are some formidable challenges. We have got to raise a big capital sum. We've got to raise £20 million. We've got to find a new temporary home between now and then. And there's lots of organisational change to go through as well. We're a team of 17 people at the moment, and we're going to have to double that over the next 3 years. So, these are all, significant challenges. But the opportunities are extraordinary because in many ways, actually, we have a blank slate. This museum is being designed, to our specifications. We're not being shoehorned into a building that isn't suitable for us. We're not inheriting a collection which might have all sorts of problems associated with it. It might be very expensive to house. We can actually be very intentional about the way we go about our approach to collecting and indeed everything. So these things are incredible opportunities. And I think above all, we've got a window of 3 years, which is it's quite long on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's sort of achievable, it's measurable. And at the end of that, there's a kind of very exciting goal. So this is an incredible opportunity to go out to people and say, this is your museum, what do you want? And how can we do it together? So what follows is just a few of the things that I think we've learned along the way that we're going to bring to delivering the permanent museum. Our museum must be a welcoming space because if it's not a truly welcoming space, it's not a place where you can actually have conversations, so people don't actually feel invited into the conversation. So this museum must feel like it's a museum for you, whoever you are. And there's something about the porosity, I think is a word, the porous nature of the space that we have in the shopping centre that's been really exciting for us, and this is something we want to bring into our permanent home. And I think you can see that. So it's about the actual physicality of the space. You can see this in the shopping centre. These are passers-by just going past our doors, but the museum's catching their eye, which they might not otherwise see. And you can see this even more. There's a rather bizarre performance actually going on in the front of our space on one Saturday morning. But you can see at the threshold to the museum, shoppers, literally, with their shopping trolleys, sort of stopped in their tracks as they peer into the museum and become engaged with what's going on. And a lot of our interactions in the museum actually start in that way. It starts with people just kind of peering in, saying, oh, what's this? And then they come in a little bit further and they meet our front of house staff who are incredibly engaging and kind of welcoming people. So, without noticing it, I think people kind of merge and cross the threshold into the museum. So I think that's one aspect of being welcoming. Another aspect, I think, is, there are many, but another is talking about stories that are familiar. This is the story of a chain of South London chicken shops called Morley's Chicken. There's one on every South London high street. And of course, this kind of, quintessentially London institution was something that was actually set up by a Tamil Sri Lankan migrant to London. And it's a funny story because Morley's Chicken is so successful that lots of other chicken shops have kind of emulated it, and they've taken on the branding and the colour palette, and they've set up establishments that are called things like Marley's Chicken and Max's Chicken. So this is a photographic project that looks at that kind of local phenomenon of these kind of chicken shops. And it's also a series of interviews with the people who frequent those shops. And some of those conversations kind of get in quite quickly into quite sort of philosophical discussions about belonging and race and empire and so on. So I think having familiar stories is another aspect of being a welcoming space. We're a very participatory museum, and we do this in all sorts of ways. One of which is to invite everybody, because we say everyone has a migration story, just to write their story on a bit of on a cardboard disc. So it can be a story about your migration story, your emigration story, your grandparents' migration story. And people say incredibly powerful and moving things in 5 lines. And of course, I now can't read that one on the left because I'm too far away from... I'm going to go up to it. It says, my parents brought me here from Afghanistan. They paid a smuggler and carried me across borders. It took us 3 years to reach Calais. We arrived in Dover in 1999. I still have the backpack I was wearing on this journey. I'm now a medical student at UCL. So people, share incredibly sort of powerful stories in a few lines. And of course, other people share, much briefer but equally moving stories. I came, I fell in love, I stayed. But we've got 8,000 or so of these discs, and actually they make a very beautiful display. And this is a kind of fundamental aspect of our collection. And I think helps people have a sense of kind of belonging to and ownership of the museum. People can touch things in our museum. This looks like an ordinary shelf of kitchen ingredients. It was in a sort of recreation of a kitchen, which was in an exhibition about people settling in and arriving in a country and how they do that. But when you pick up those objects, those ingredients, in the same style as the label, there are personal stories on all of those labels. And this is another room in the same exhibition. It's a bedroom. Typically the first room you arrive on when you arrive and set up home in a new country will be your bedroom. But in this room, you can pull out the suitcase under the bed, and there's a story in there, and you can open the book by the bed, and you can pull out the drawers. So very kind of immersive and participatory in that sense. And these environments, we found, elicit very kind of emotional responses from our visitors who really do want to share their stories. So this is something, a way in which we've elicited, I think, participatory responses from visitors. But participation isn't just about visitor contributions. It's also about actually fabricating and devising and designing the museum with people. So this is someone called Angela Hoy. She's an author. She wrote this book called Takeaway. She's a journalist as well. And it's about her life growing up as a takeaway kid. Her parents were immigrants from Hong Kong, and they set up a takeaway in the Welsh valleys. And she didn't want to carry on that business. But she's written this book, which became a bestseller. And then she, for our exhibition, we did an exhibition all about migrant entrepreneurs. She guest curated her parents' takeaway shop. So she designed this. It looks very similar to her parents' shop, but there are lots of interactive elements there as well. You can pick up the phone where they would have taken the orders, and you can hear stories of other takeaway kids that Angela has interviewed. So this is an aspect of people participating with us, but actually in devising and designing and delivering, actually fabricating the museum itself. And another example of this is, these are our community curators. We recently recruited these people, have trained them and mentored them in curation. And they put out a call for local artists who wanted to show work on migration themes, and had an incredible response. And they have themselves put together a really beautiful exhibition of art on migration themes. In fact, the call out was so successful that they're going to do a second iteration of that. So it's about being participatory in all of those ways. The museum is conversational. Sometimes when the museum's got, you know, lots of people in it, there's a real sort of buzz of conversation, and that's one of the things I really love about our museum, which, you know, museums are often quiet places, but ours is quite a conversational place. When there's a trip from a school or a community group, often they will sit round at the end and they'll reflect on what they've seen and heard in a lovely sort of circle like this. This is quite a feature of our museum, but these kind of intense, thoughtful conversations that go on. And I like this picture because it looks like these boys are on a school trip, they're in their school uniforms, but actually they're not. They're just dropping in on their way back through the shopping centre after school. And what they're engaging with is really quite an obscure bit of 19th century emigration history. This is a recreation of a quilt called the Raja quilt, made by English convicts, convict women who are being transported to Tasmania in the middle of the 19th century. And if you turn over those tiles, you can learn about the story of Mary, who was transported for 7 years for stealing a pair of socks. I mean, literally. But, you know, I think this is an unusual museum audience. And we have really conversational artworks as well. This is by an artist called Angelica Das, and she takes portraits of people, and then she sets them against their Pantone paint colour. And this really does get people just talking to each other. It's got lots of puzzles in it, actually. You can see that these two people have got an identical skin colour, identical paint colour. But actually, if they were self-identifying on an ethnicity monitoring questionnaire, they probably describe themselves in very different ways. And being conversational, I think, is also about engaging with topical issues. This was a front window. It's not a brilliant picture, I'm afraid, but it was art students from the Lviv School of Art who have made work in Lviv responding to the conflict in Ukraine. And they came over and they showed their work, and it was accompanied by a programme of events and discussions and so on. And this was a football campaign that we did for the 2020 Euros. And our graphic we created on the left, and this went out on social media and in pubs and on billboards all over the country. And it looked at what the England starting lineup would look like without first or second generation immigration. And as you can see, there are only 4 players left. And England got to the final of that competition and lost on penalties. And I don't know if you remember this, but there were 3 young black players who missed penalties. And there was an outpouring of racist abuse against them on social media. And that itself was picked up as a news story by outlets like the New York Times and Sky Sports and so on. And our graphic, which went properly viral, it reached 5 million people, was used as the way of introducing that story, of kind of framing that debate. So I think this is the museum being kind of conversational, you know, beyond the museum. So we deal with topics which are often contested and difficult and all of those kind of things, but our tone of voice, I think, is often really quite playful, and we really want the museum to be an enjoyable experience. Sometimes, you know, this is through programming. This is just an example of quite exuberant programming, Colombian dancing. There are lots of activities in the museum. It's quite a kind of vibrant living place. So there are things like this that you can drop in and do at weekends, like nail art and making ear cuffs for carnival. You know, there are any number of activities that go on at the museum. And quite playful works as well. So this is a departure lounge in our current exhibition, looking actually at British emigration, which is a big, long, complicated, you know, fascinating story. But actually, the way of framing this is a an imaginary departure lounge done by a lovely artist called Jiro Osuga. And there are all sorts of strange things happening in that picture. There are aliens taking flights, and there are ancient Egyptians and Victorians. But I think, just a kind of playful approach sometimes is a way of making the conversation a bit more enjoyable. We're very collaborative, and that's just on the individual level, but also at the institutional level. And the collaborations, there are hundreds of these, but I suppose this is just one example I wanted to talk about with a refugee who we've worked with now for 8 years. And we did an exhibition all about the jungle refugee camp in 2016. And this was just in the run-up to the EU referendum when Britain voted to leave the European Union. And the newspaper coverage was of the most sort of dehumanizing kind about and negative about migration. And we wanted to put on an exhibition, and it particularly focused on the jungle refugee camp in Calais. That was a particular focus of sort of dehumanizing coverage. And we wanted to put on an exhibition about the people in that camp, and just to sort of explore the humanity behind the headlines. So one of the things we did was to show the art, or some of the art. There was fantastic things being done in that camp. So top left is a refugee from Afghanistan called Habib, and he's there in the camp painting a picture of a temple in Afghanistan, and he also made a model of the temple. And we showed, so the next picture on the right is us showing that in our exhibition. This was in 2016. And this was at a time that, he couldn't travel, but his art could. He later made it to the United Kingdom. He claimed asylum and he was granted refugee status. And he then made this model on the right-hand side, which is made from found objects. It's a model of the refugee camp. And we then displayed that model. And he's seen there shaking hands with the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. And he then, Habib, went on to work with another of our collaborators, which is an organisation called Migrateful, where migrant and refugee chefs teach other people how to make food from the countries they come from, and everybody gathers round and they all cook a meal together, and then they sit down and eat it together. So I guess this is just an example of a kind of collaborative approach over many years with one individual, but as I say, there are many, many examples of this. And at an institutional level, I've just got one more minute. We collaborate with institutions across the United Kingdom. We have a sector-supporting migration network which aims to bring out and share best practice in telling migration stories within existing collections across the country. So this is a kind of sector-supporting role that we play that's now reached thousands of people and hundreds of institutions. And we are working with some institutions like the British Library and Liverpool museums and people like that to curate but not hold a dispersed digital collection that is held by those institutions but curated and joined up by the Migration Museum. So I think sort of collaboration and networking and dispersing our model is kind of key to what we have done. And finally, I think this is just looping back to the beginning. I think we're a purposive organisation. We are doing this because we hope we can do something to contribute to a better conversation, support teaching and learning, and be a place where people feel that their stories matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Do we have any questions? One question here, please.
Hi there, this is Stefanos Hirovic from the European Network of Science Centres and Museums. You made reference to the anti-immigration rhetoric there in the press. Has this been affecting your own work, both, practically and in terms of your position in the communities that you operate? Not everybody, I suppose, who shows up that area you are is sympathetic to the causes that you propose, which means that you need to preach beyond the converted ones.
I think, it's such an interesting question. We're still a relatively small organisation, so, in many ways, we're sort of under the radar. We haven't come to people's attention. That is I think, watch this space. It's going to become much more of an issue for us. But I think the anti-immigration rhetoric is, really just underscores our purpose. I think it underscores the need for the museum. And actually, you may know that in the summer in Britain, there was an outbreak of racist rioting. There was a rumour that an asylum seeker was responsible for a horrible stabbing incident. And I think, you know, the sort of, what that brought home was the volatility of public opinion. In many ways, attitudes have actually softened towards migrants. Actually, over time, the evidence suggests that that is the case. But attitudes are volatile, so that the salience of migration quite rapidly goes up and down, and it takes an incident like that to bring it right up to the forefront, and that, you know, is a dangerous thing because it affects how people behave. So that kind of, you know, makes us, I think, makes us more important. In terms of, we haven't attracted negative coverage so far. Occasionally we get people walking into the shopping centre, but it's only occasionally who come in and say, what's this kind of woke nonsense? You know, why, who funds you? What's all this about? But it's about, I think, this thing about being playful, about being welcoming, about being friendly, about you know, saying this is about human stories. This is about things we have in common. Actually, normally we can, on a one-to-one level, I think we can sort of diffuse and deal with those conversations. It remains to be seen whether, you know, we can do that on a bigger scale, but I think that's our approach.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Sophie Henderson.